There's a lot of pain in this room. It's a very difficult case, but this is the resolution that we have accepted and that we believe is appropriate given all of the circumstances.
A former youth pastor out in Kansas will spend the next few decades in prison after admitting that he set his house on fire and stabbed his wife and children. You know why? Because apparently he'd been hiding a huge secret from them. We're going to take you inside the courtroom where a judge had to decide how much mercy, if any, to show a defendant who admitted to such a gruesome crime. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. 43-year-old Matthew Lee Richards was sentenced last week after he entered a guilty plea to 2 charges of attempted first-degree murder. And this was the end of a very long journey in the justice system that was kicked off in September of 2023 when Richards stabbed his entire family and set fire to their home in Shawnee, Kansas. This is a horrifying attack. I want to set the stage for you for this brutal attack. So at the time, Richards was serving, as of all things, a children's pastor at Crossroads Christian Church. He was also apparently teaching English to 7th graders at Christ Preparatory Academy, where he started working in 2020, according to a bio on their website that's since been removed. Now, Richards' wife was the director of Crossroads Christian Preschool, according to her LinkedIn profile. They had 5 children. They were all living in their home with them. One was 19 years old. The rest were all minors. Now, we know many of the details about what happened inside of this home on September 16, 2023, because of a probable cause affidavit that was filed by the Shawnee police, and it included statements from the victims, whose injuries ranged from superficial cuts to deep lacerations. One of the children, and I'm sorry to say this, had been slashed across the stomach, and first responders could actually see the child's internal organs. That is what we're dealing with right now. Now, here's the thing. Miraculously, somehow, all 6 victims survived their injuries. But their last night together as a family, that was nothing short of terrifying. To talk about this, I want to bring on somebody who I haven't seen in quite some time, used to make all the appearances almost every week on the Law&Crime Network, Judge Brandon Birmingham out in Texas. Judge, so good to see you. Thanks for taking the time to come here on Sidebar.
Very good to see you again, man. It's very good to be back.
What is your initial reaction to a story like this? You know, we deal with brutal crimes, but a brutal crime committed by the patriarch of the family and everyone survived. There's so many different elements and layers to this.
There are. The very first thing that sticks out to me is the sort of the betrayal of the natural affections. You know, it's not often that children are murdered, first of all, but it's not very often that they're murdered by their father. And it's that betrayal of that sort of natural relationship, one that's supposed to be a protector of the house, somebody that's supposed to stand guard and make sure nothing bad happens to anybody in the house, is the one in this case, who, you know, committed such horrible acts. And I think the other part of it is, I hate to say, but in a typical murder case, we don't hear about the last moments of the person's life. We're sort of left to piece them together. But because you have surviving witnesses, you have some of these chilling details about what the moments were like in the throes of this crime.
And I want to dig into some of the details here. So according to the affidavit, and I know this is really difficult to hear, but it's important to lay out what's happening here. So according to the affidavit, officers responded just after 3 a.m. This is the middle of the night. And they were responding regarding several 911 calls about a house fire and someone chasing them with a knife. One of the callers said their dad was chasing them with a knife, and the dispatcher could hear a fire alarm sounding in the background. An additional caller states she had been stabbed. And when the officers got to the home, this scene, they saw several of the victims outside the house with cuts, with stab wounds, and that is when they heard an explosion from the garage and reported that the doors bowed out. The affidavit states officers spoke to a child with a wound to the neck who stated they were all in bed when dad came around stabbing everyone and they all ran outside. Just picture what that would have been like for them. That is, unimaginable. Now, some of the victims were treated at the scene and released, but there were other ones who had to be rushed to the hospital, including Richards, who was suffering from smoke inhalation. But according to police, Richards made this case very easy. He confessed almost immediately. And the motive behind this unspeakable stabbing spree was revealed. Quote, once he was medically cleared, the defendant, in a post-Miranda interview, told police, "I stabbed my family. The defendant said that he had not been honest with his wife regarding their financial situation and the fact that they were supposed to be evicted that very day. They had not packed anything, and no one in the family knew they were being evicted. The defendant said he formulated the plan to burn the house down earlier in the evening. Now, Judge, a lot of things here. First of all, post-Miranda, very important, right? This happened post-Miranda rights. And what do you make of that explanation? Because I don't even know if that's true or not, what was going on with the financial situation. But what do you take away from it?
The fact that it was a post-Miranda interview means that it's admissible in court, and that cinches up the case as far as proving who did the crime. Now, I'm not sure even if they wouldn't have had this post-Miranda interview, because there were surviving witnesses, there would have been really any doubt given what the witnesses would have testified to, that it was Daddy, and Daddy went through room to room and all of that. Then you get into the part of motive, and motive to me is what always separates the crimes. Some motives, potential jurors can look at and say, yeah, I can kind of understand why this person did that. One of the good examples that comes to mind is stealing. Not everybody condones stealing, but if you're stealing for a noble purpose like to feed your children, people can probably understand that. Here, I suppose the motive was to burn the house down because he was in debt. At least that's what he told the detectives. So, okay, well, that's the motive for the burning, but why stab the children and why try to end everybody's life? And I guess the motive ultimately was to try to avoid shame brought onto the family that he brought onto the family by, I guess, being in financial ruin. So that's the motive. It was enough to stir him and cause him to do the crime. Ultimately, I think that anybody would tell you that's not a very good reason to try to wipe out your entire family, if there could ever be a good reason to do that.
If that is true, though, this wouldn't be the first time you've ever seen a case of desperation, right? And people acting crazy in desperate. And when I say crazy, I don't mean a legal term crazy. I mean, committing a crime that you can't even make sense of. But this wouldn't be the first time that someone acts out in desperation. And not trying to justify it, but trying to understand it.
Yeah, I think it's important to know that the thing about motive is that it is judged by the community, but it inspires people individually. And what may be a good rational motive to one person is totally irrational to somebody else. But the thing about motive is that they're constantly measured against what the community would do. And I think that's what you see reflected in jury verdicts on punishment, or, in this case, a sentence of just under 30 years. The law tries to take that into account. Up for debate is whether that motive is one that would be accepted by people across the board. And this case, maybe more than any other, proves that motive is definitely individualized and personal to the person who commits it.
And it makes sense that he was charged with attempted murder, right? This couldn't be classified as a heat of passion type event, right? Because it seemed to me there was a semblance of a plan here.
Sure. Once you have, the three main things: motive, means, and opportunity. We know what his motive was because he said it. We know that he had the means in order to do it, and obviously he had the opportunity. I think you can look at the number of wounds, the number of victims. You can look at how long the crime took. You can look at the location and as well as the time. And you can put all these things together to say this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a spur of the moment thing. He did have a plan. He took measures to make this plan happen. And the time really that it must have taken to commit this crime, it does show that it was planned. It was, to use the old term from the old days, premeditated. And all of those things indicate this was an intentional crime, which is what's required for a criminal attempt. You have to prove the person intended to commit the crime. They took acts in furtherance of that, but failed to commit the actual crime. So this is a textbook attempted homicide case, attempted first-degree murder.
Now, going back to this affidavit, it reads, quote, "The defendant went on to say that he remembered his wife on the ground, and he was on top of her and struggling with her over the knife, and she was screaming his name. The defendant admitted to having the thought that it would be better if they all died rather than for the kids to have to deal with the trauma of finding out the truth and for his wife to find out the truth. The defendant denied remembering stabbing the children. He did admit that his son said, 'Dad, why do you have the knife?' when he was upstairs with the kids. The defendant said he remembered thinking he was a monster. When a detective tried to minimize the statement, the defendant said, 'I stabbed my kids, detective. I stabbed my wife.'" Judge, no way that a defense attorney would get past that, right? If this went to trial and he didn't plead guilty, what do you do as a defense attorney there?
Well, yeah, I think you're well past the point of saying it wasn't me. I don't think you can claim self-defense, again, especially with those little kids. There's no way you can claim that. You can't claim defense of a third person. You probably can't claim that the state's evidence isn't strong enough about who did it after you confess. So what do? Well, there's only one more defense left, and that is insanity. The problem with the insanity defense is you have to prove that the person didn't know right from wrong. One of the ways to defeat insanity, if you're the prosecution, is to prove planning, is to prove you're acting out a motive, whether that's a good motive or bad motive doesn't matter, but you're acting it out. And then, of course, the statements that you make afterwards. And when he tells the detective, hey, listen, there's no need to minimize this in so many words. I stabbed my family. I stabbed my wife and my kids. That shows that he does know the difference between right and wrong. And once all of those things come into play, and as we said before, all of those things will be admissible post Miranda, then the defense attorney has to look and say, well, maybe this isn't the type of case where I say this guy needs to walk the streets again. He's not guilty of the crime, but really, this is about punishment and what's the appropriate punishment. How can I build now my punishment case, given that guilt is pretty much a foregone conclusion in these cases? And so let's try to work on a lower punishment or a plea bargain.
And what's fascinating about this is, and tragic about this is, not only do you have his apparent confession, but, the statements from the victims. So during the attack, at least some of the children, they were able to get out of the house and go for help. The affidavit reads, according to a neighbor, they heard banging on their front door and opened the door and saw the children. The children said that their dad had gone room to room throughout the house and stabbed them. So it's not even if you needed their testimony, right? Because look at the injury sustained, look at his confession. But you also have to, I imagine what a trial like this would have looked like. A part of me wonders, even if you have a deal that is not life in prison for him, and it's significant prison time, and we'll get more to it, but it makes me think you save the pain and the trauma of potentially these children having to testify from a jury having to see these wounds, right? I mean, there is a benefit about not going to trial on a case like this, right, Judge?
There is a bigger picture, yes, of course. And I worked in the Crimes Against Children Division when I was a prosecutor in Dallas for several years, and that is a consideration. It's not one that you normally take into account when you have an adult, although it's not unheard of to take that into account. But with children, especially against their own parents, there is a bigger picture. Are you really going to put the child up to point a finger at their father or their loved one, whoever that may be, put them through the trauma of having to be cross-examined, talking in front of a room full of strangers, asking and answering questions under oath? I'm sure there'd be TV cameras there. It can be an overwhelming thing for a child. And so as the prosecutor, you want to take that into account. And actually, there's another component that I've seen too, which is that the defendant in a case like this may not want to put their children through it. So, they're more likely, when their guilt is a foregone conclusion, like it was here, to agree to something because they don't want to put their children through it too. It stems from shame and remorse and regret for having done what they did. So there's an impact on the defendant's decision to enter into a guilty plea as well.
Now, the fire crews, they found where Richards had started the fire in the basement of the home, used wood, clothing. They were able to extinguish the flames, but according to Kansas court records, Richards was charged with 1 count of attempted murder in the first degree, which I believe could be filed as a capital offense, meaning Richard could have potentially gotten the death penalty here. Also, 4 counts of premeditated attempted murder and aggravated arson with risk of bodily harm. You can see those charges on TruthFinder, the powerful background checker that we use. We've entered Richards' name and location, quickly found this profile. According to TruthFinder, Richards didn't have a criminal history before this violent attack, just a speeding ticket, which makes this even more bizarre and chilling. Now, Law&Crime, we partner with TruthFinder. We use the details on people involved in our stories, but even if you don't work in true crime, it can be an excellent resource to give you some peace of mind. After all, it's one of the largest public record search services in the United States. And with the paid subscription service, you can get access to unlimited reports about almost anyone. So right now, if you're interested, you can get 50% off of your first month of confidential background reports. Just go to truthfinder.com/LC Sidebar. So back in February, Richards entered a guilty plea to 2 of the attempted murder charges. And the prosecution and Richards' public defender, they reached a plea deal, which they presented to Judge Jason Birmingham.
Judge, I'm asking the court to follow this agreement. As the court knows, there was a substantial amount of time that was put into reaching this resolution. It was mediated with Your Honor. I do feel it is an appropriate way to resolve a very difficult case. Your Honor, the plea agreement calls for an upward durational departure on count 1. The state filed back on November 28th of 23 the notice of an intent and motion for upward durational departure that lists 2 aggravating factors. Pursuant to the agreement, Judge, both parties are asking this court to adopt those aggravating factors and impose an upward durational sentence on count 1 of 188 months. Judge, as to count 2, that would be a high box sentence of 165 and run those consecutive to each other for 353 months.
And according to victim impact statements from his family members, Richards had been dealing with mental health issues that affected his behavior. And Richards' mom spoke first.
I'm Matt's mom. What I want to address is to my son. My little boy yesterday, my friend today, my son forever. Never forget that I am so proud of you and I love you more than anything in this world. Love, Mama.
Thank you, ma'am.
Richard's sister also spoke in support of him.
I am that sister. I am Stephanie's sister-in-law. And I am speaking on behalf of both of them because I believe that this is a very unique case. This is not one that it's a bad guy did a bad thing. It's a good guy did a bad thing. There are consequences to this, and nobody is denying this situation. Nobody. We all know there's consequences. However, this is a good guy. And there's a reason why my sister-in-law had to go and get her own representation, because the DA did not want to listen to her wishes or her wants. And that should be taken into consideration. Why would they have to go and do that? I think that those children don't need to be apart from their father that long, honestly. He was a present father. He didn't have a present father, and he was a present father. He's a wonderful man who helped everybody that he could. He just didn't know how to help himself. Mental illness is a real thing. Now that we know what it is, we know how to go about fixing things and treating things, because it is for men. It's a faux pas. Nobody wants it to be fixed or don't know how. Their pride. They don't want to admit that there's something wrong. And now that we know how we can go about fixing it. And I think being gone for that long, away from everybody, would do more harm than good.
Now, Richards himself was given the opportunity to speak and at times had trouble composing himself.
Mr. Richards. Through my actions, I brought disgrace, shame, humiliation, and dishonor on myself, my family, kids in classrooms, on soccer fields, trusted friends, and my community. This came from my own shame that kept me from revealing my faults and sins, because I was afraid of the truth. I was afraid to ask for help. The shame and fear led me further down a path that brought out not only disgrace, but also violence into the lives of my family. Your Honor, I will live every day knowing I caused that trauma and disgrace. That punishment is far worse than any physical or length of time in a prison I can be in. To my wife and kids, and the rest of my family, I'm sorry for the multiple levels of destruction and pain that will take lifetimes to overcome. When my wife and I taught our kids how to apologize, we wanted them to say, "I'm sorry for whatever the offense was." And while I do offer a short apology today, the most important words and apologies will one day, hopefully soon, be shared and should be shared in private moments. I need to make those apologies to the people I love and hurt the most in private and out of time when they are ready.
And he was officially sentenced to 353 months in prison, which comes out to 29 years and 5 months. Judge, let's first start with what we heard in court, in the sense you hear from different people that talk about the defendant. You hear the words of the defendant himself. Does that affect a judge's decision?
Of course. It's a somber moment. It's usually the most emotional moments in the courtroom when all the evidence is done, the decision about whether the person is guilty or not guilty is in, and now you've got to make a decision about whether you're going to follow the plea agreement or not. And you hear from the people that are most affected by this. And to be sure, whatever happens in the courtroom is going to go away. There's going to be a new case next week, and for the practitioners, it'll stick with them. But for the family members, it's going to be a part of their life history woven into the fabric long after the court proceedings are finished. So when you're a judge and you're listening to the sister, the mother speak, you can't help but feel a certain amount of sorrow for her. I heard the mom, his mom say, "No matter what, forevermore, you're going to be my son." And that touched me. I think that my mom would probably say the same thing. It's really hard to undo that love between a mother and a son. And that was touching. And so, yes, you take it into account. The question is always, where does that fit into the legal calculation? And in this case, this was an agreed upon plea. The judge, I suppose, could have departed from it, but both sides were in agreement about this was the proper outcome given the competing interest in the case.
He would get out in his 70s. You think that's fair?
Well, man, oh man. I think it was a good balance to avoid some perhaps permanent long-term damage to the children by testifying. It certainly is not a measure of whether or not he was guilty or not. You do have to remember, though, this is only an attempted murder case. In other words, nobody actually died. He did take steps to make sure that it happened, but he failed in that. There's a part of it, too. And I think we got a good lesson about how the Kansas sentencing guidelines work, and this was at the top end of those guidelines once the plea bargain was reached.
Judge Brandon Birmingham, thanks so much for coming on. Difficult case, I know, but it was good seeing you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Very good to be here.
All right, everybody, what a case. That's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.